Hello and welcome back everyone. This is Gina from McGuire and I'm glad you're here. Today I am sharing with you several different ways to do Eclipse techniques. Eclipse technique is where you have a die cut shape on your card and it's raised up. So it's somewhat subtle, but if you tilt the card you can kind of see it, and there are many ways to do this. I will share examples where the technique is very obvious and some where they're more subtle. I chose to use alphabet dies for the Eclipse technique portion of the card on each of my examples. The reason I did this is I wanted to show you the different looks you can get from one product. But keep in mind you can do this technique with any shape dies that you may have. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. My first pair of cards is a variation of the Eclipse technique that results in two cards at once. This variation also provides more contrast, so you can see those letters that are raised up in the background a bit more. We'll do more subtle options later on. For this particular technique, we need to stamp two backgrounds. One of them I will stamp in a light ink, and the other in a darker ink that will color. So here I have white cardstock, and I'm stamping an older Pinkfresh Studio background stamp with Simon Says stamp fog ink. And I'm double stamping it just so it shows up a little bit more. I like that this is a super light gray ink. Now in this same location on another piece of white cardstock, I'll stamp the same image with Gina K Amalgam black ink. This is a Copic friendly ink and it stamps nice and dark. So now I have two pieces stamped in the exact same place on two pieces of white cardstock. So for the black outlined image, I'm quickly coloring in with Copic markers. I'm going to skip through this part since I didn't do anything fancy, but I did list for you over on the side the colors that I used to get these results. I also colored in the background, so instead of white showing around our colored flowers, I colored it in with my T1 marker, so it had a light gray background. I just thought that gave a nice complete look. Next, I decided to trim the backgrounds down, but I want to trim them in the same way. So I'm holding the two together and cutting a bit off of each side. That way I can be sure that the image is still in the same location on the two pieces. Now the die set that I'll be using for the Eclipse portion of all of our cards is from Pinkfresh Studio and it's the Adore Alpha dies. You can see they're a little bit taller than 1 1/4 inches. And it cuts out the letter and a thin outline. This is a fun variation of an alphabet die, and I'm really excited about it, but you could use regular alphabet dies that don't have the outline if you want. Okay, so I decided to die cut the word U from each of these panels. So I'm starting by doing the U on the bottom, then the Y on the top, and then I will center the O in between those two letters and hold them there with a little bit of purple tape. I'm going to run this through my die cut machine, and I'm actually have the other stamped piece right behind it. So I'm cutting through both layers at once. Now you can see it cut through the colored piece beautifully, but it really only made kind of an indentation in the softer piece in the background. But that's okay, I'm using heavyweight cardstock, so I didn't expect it to cut through both layers. However, there are indentations, so I'm just going to put the dies right into the indentation. It just kind of pops in place. Tape the dies in place and run it through the die cut machine again. This will cut through that lighter layer. So now I have the word U die cut in the exact same location from our two backgrounds. So the stamping and the die cutting will line up. Now I could glue the different die cuts back into place on the card with some dimension behind them for traditional Eclipse technique, which you'll see later. But I decided to swap them and put the lighter letters into the darker background and the darker letters into the lighter background. I have a top folding white note card and I'm putting a generous amount of adhesive towards the center of that note card, so that when I put this background in place, there's adhesive in those open die cut letter areas. I am going to take the outline piece that this die cut and glue that in place. Most alphabet dies don't have that outline piece, so you would just have to skip this part. But I like that the outline option is there because we can change that up, and we'll do that in future examples in this video. So now I have the word U to add into the center. What I did is I die cut each of the letters 3 times from white cardstock. and I'm gluing them all behind our light stamped letter. That way there's dimension when we pop it in place. So these letters are 4 thicknesses so that it will give you that eclipse look where you have the letters popped out against the background. You can do as many layers as you want, and you'll see those options later. And you can even die cut from craft foam if you want to save time and use that for dimension. So with this particular variation of the technique, we have a continuous stamp pattern that goes across the whole front of the card. It just happens to be darker in the background and lighter on those raised letters, so you can see that continuous stamping. Then I also added the dimension behind the letters so they would stand out a bit, and a white heat emboss sentiment strip at the center. That sentiment is from this Pinkfresh Studio Forest Friends stamp set. I've used this one before in a video, and I'll link to it in the top right if you want to check that out. So here is the other card, which I created just like the last one. It has a much softer look because we have the softer background. Now on this one, I decided to take advantage of the fact that the Adore dies cut the outline of the letter. So I cut the outline from some Gina K Whisper cardstock. That's the same color I used for the note card that I created for this card. So I'm just going to glue that Whisper outline around each of the letters just to help it stand out a bit. You could totally skip this step, but I thought it was a fun option. So in this case, we still have that beautiful floral background that's continuous across both the light background and those raised letters. And by the way, behind each of those raised letters are 3 additional white die cuts just to add that dimension. Now this So Happy From You is from a Pinkfresh Studio Scripted Bold Sentiment stamp set. There are 2 variations. On the left happens to be the Sentiments 2 set, and on the right is the Sentiments 1 set. I use the Sentiment 2 set for that So Happy For You, but I wanted to show both of these options because I like that fun, large styled sentiment and also the smaller sentiments that can be used below it or on the inside of the card. I actually decided to use the Hooray from the Sentiments 1 stamp and stamp that onto my envelope so it matched the card perfectly. Okay, so let's create another type of eclipse card. This is a more traditional eclipse technique, where when you look at it straight on, you barely see the die cutting, but when you tilt it, you see that raised dimension. I will start once again by stamping on a white panel. This time I'm using the Pinkfresh Studio Make-A-Wish stamp set, which is so much fun. It's a large set with many different images that you can build together and layer to create a fun cake that's small or a cake that's large, and you can decorate it in many ways. I'm starting by stamping the cake itself onto white cardstock. I then need to stamp the cake again, but this time onto a Post-it note, so I can do a bit of basic masking. I'm using all Gina K inks for this, but you could use any inks that you may have. So after I cut out my little cake mask, I'll put it right over the cake itself, and then we can take the cake stand image. This one I'm going to stamp with Hero Art's Soft Granite ink, which is my favorite kind of silvery gray color. Making sure my mask is in place, and then I'll stamp this. Quick masking like this can really create great results, and it doesn't take much time at all. I'll continue to add some details to the cake. One of the things I really like about this set is it has number candles, so you can make the card specifically personalized for the recipient. So this is going to my friend who's turning 44. And then I'm also adding some icing details. Once I've done all of my stamping, it's time to die cut the word Yay. Now to do so, I first die cut the A from the center, and then I die cut the Y from right next to that on the left and the right. And I'm trying to get the letters as close as I can. After I ran this through my die cut machine and cut the letters, it's time to reassemble the card, and I have a piece of white cardstock here that I'm covering generously with adhesive so that when I put my background down, there's adhesive in those open letter areas. We can then add those letters right back in place. However, I added dimension behind the letters for Yay. So I die cut Yay 4 times from white cardstock and glued them to the back of the stamped letters. And then we're adding those in place on our card. And that gives you that eclipse look. From the front, you just see the continuous stamping. From the side, you see the dimension on those raised letters. I added Make a Wish to the bottom and then also added a few little stamped flowers and leaves. These are included in that same stamp set, and I used the coordinating dies. I also added a few iridescent gemstones and put everything onto a pool colored note card that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 top folding. So there you can see this traditional eclipse card where you die cut letters from a continuous stamp background and then add them back in place with dimension behind them. And remember, you can do this with any die shape. So you could do a heart here, a star, a balloon, anything you want. I also stamped an additional sentiment on the inside of the card and the matching envelope. Okay, let's do another set of cards here. I actually have 4 cards that I made at once. Now, in this case, I'm doing continuous stamping over the entire card and adding the Eclipse technique. And for some of my examples, I'm using an embossed resist. Now, for the panels where I want to do heat embossing, I actually like to do the die cutting first. The reason I do the die cutting first is sometimes when you die cut intricate dies from a heat embossed background, the embossing can get damaged. So I like to die cut first and then do the heat embossing. In this case, I've lined up the letters for thanks and I've positioned them together and I'm putting tons of tape on the back. The reason I'm putting so much tape is I'm going to run this through my machine multiple times and I don't want them to shift. And also, I can reuse that tape on another project when I'm done. So I'm taking the connected letters and positioning them at the center of a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of white cardstock and running it through a die cut machine. I'm going to carefully take this apart so that I keep all of the letters in the dies. Now, you don't have to do this, but it makes it easier. So I'm taking a piece of Gina K Masking Magic. This is meant for masking, but it's also just a great sticky paper to hold things in place temporarily. I place that over the back of my die cutting, and I'm kind of pressing down to make sure that I grab hold of all those letters. Now I'm going to carefully remove my dies from the piece, and you can see how all of the letters are still together. They're all in place in the background, which will make this very easy. If any of the pieces come out, that's okay, just put them back in place. If you don't have masking paper, you can also use press and seal or any large sticky note to hold those together temporarily. Okay, now I went ahead and did this with 2 pieces of pool cardstock, one that's medium and one that's dark, and then we have our white, so I can do all of these at once. I'm going to stamp over those die cut backgrounds using the Pinkfresh Studio Embroidered Blossoms stamp set. This is a gorgeous set that creates faux stitched looks, especially when they're heat embossed. Check out the beautiful colored examples on the packaging. I love the look of this, but today I decided to go with monochromatic looks. Okay, so I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white cardstock in my MISTI stamping tool. I'm just using that as a guide since that's the same size as the die cut backgrounds we just created. And I'm arranging images from that stamp set very close together in a cluster kind of towards the center. I'm transferring them into the door of my MISTI, and now I have a bunch of flowers positioned close together. We're going to stamp over the entire backgrounds we just die cut. So this will get us started. I have my white background that's die cut. I'm adding anti-static powder tool over that so we get clean heat embossing. I'll ink up my stamps with VersaFine ink, and I have my panel positioned exactly where our guide was positioned when we arranged our stamps. So I'm stamping over that, and you want to press very firmly so that you get into the nooks and crannies of the die cutting. I'm then adding regular white embossing powder over that and setting that aside, and we'll heat emboss it after we've done our other embossed backgrounds. So on my darker pool piece, I'm stamping once again with VersaFine ink, pressing very firmly. Once I've stamped that, I'm adding this time Hero Art's white satin pearl embossing powder. This is a fun powder that gives a pearly metallic shine to whatever color cardstock you put it on. And then finally the third panel, the lighter pool colored. I'm doing the exact same thing as the last one. Stamping with VersaFine ink and then adding that white satin pearl embossing powder. Now I can heat set all of those backgrounds, and you can see the tone-on-tone looks that we get. Kind of hard to see the white on white embossing, but you'll be able to see it more when we do the next steps. Now I figured since I had all these stamps arranged and positioned perfectly, I would do a fourth background. This has no heat embossing, but I just stamped with Gina K Ocean Mist ink onto white cardstock, and I haven't done the die cutting on that yet. Next, I moved the flowers so I could cover the rest of the background area. I used small images, so it was necessary for me to do the stamping and heat embossing in 2 steps to make sure we covered everything. Next, I went ahead and added the stamping with these images in the same location onto our white background, stamped it with Versamark ink, added white embossing powder, and then for the 2 pool colored backgrounds, I once again stamped with Versamark ink and added the satin embossing powders. Now that we have all of our embossing and stamping over the die cutting, it's time to assemble these. On an extra piece of cardstock, I've put a generous amount of adhesive towards the center. And now we can remove that masking magic. Remember that was there just to hold them in place while we did our stamping and heat embossing? I can remove that from the back, and I can reuse this piece, so I'm not going to get rid of it. I'm going to keep that and reuse it on another card. Now I can take all of my die cut pieces out, position that over the adhesive that we've already put down, and then I will add the outline pieces back in place, but I will leave out the solid letters. We're going to swap between our 2 backgrounds that are pool colored. One's darker, one's lighter, and we'll swap the letters so they stand out more. We'll do the exact same thing with the darker pool background. So I'm taking the masking magic off, and we'll take the negative space and place it onto a piece of cardstock that I've put lots of adhesive on. That way all the open letters have adhesive in them and are ready to go to add the letters back in place. Now first I wanted to show you another way you can add dimension behind these layers. On my previous cards, I die cut several extra white die cuts and glued them to the back of our stamped letters. Well, this time I'm using craft foam. I'll link to the white craft foam that I use. It die cuts beautifully with any die cut machine. On one of my cards, I actually die cut from craft foam 2 of each letter and glued them together for a huge amount of dimension. You can see how thick that is. But I find it holds up going through the mail quite nicely because it has a little give to it because it's craft foam. Notice that I'm putting the medium shade pool letters into the darker background just for added contrast. You could just keep the same color in the same background, totally up to you. Now for our stamped background, I just put 1 layer of craft foam behind each of the die cut letters. And I also added a darker pool outline using the Pinkfresh Studio Adore dies. I just thought that would make it stand out more against this busy background. So after I put the letters back in place on this particular one, I added a sentiment from an older Pinkfresh Studio stamp set called Bloom. It has a few small sentiments that are great, and I decided to use the Hello Friend since it's super tiny, and I could stamp that on a small die cut heart and add it to the center of our card. So with this example, I was able to create a stamped background using smaller images. Then I die cut from it and pop them out with added dimension for a fun eclipse look. I also added the outline to make it stand out more. So you can see from the side that little bit of dimension that I got with the white craft foam die cut letters behind the stamped die cut letters. Okay, let's look at the other examples. This one has the double layer of craft foam die cuts behind our stamped die cuts. So you can see there's tons of dimension on this one. But we still have that continuous stamp pattern across the entire card that we use that pearl embossing powder for. It's just beautiful. It gives a gorgeous tone on tone with lots of shine. And by the way, just to be safe, I will mail this in a padded envelope. I figure if I spend this much time on a card, I want to make sure that it gets there safely. So I don't mind using a simple padded envelope for some of my thicker cards. Now here's the other pool card that I created. This one has the lighter background and the darker letters. And I only put 1 layer of craft foam behind each of the letter die cuts. But I changed the design on this one a bit, and I stamped some of the same embroidered flowers on white cardstock with Gina K Ocean Mist ink. And I used the coordinating dies to cut them out and added them on top of our letters. I figured these letters were big enough that you could still see them in the background, but they weren't the focal point. They were just kind of a little bit of a background interest. And by the way, that very lovely sentiment that says, "You are gracious and kind," is from this older Pinkfresh Studio Thanks stamp set. Now remember, we still have that white background where we white heat emboss the flowers over the white die cut background. We're going to do embossed resist here. For this, I'm applying colorful inks just to the letters themselves. I decided to use my life-changing brushes to apply Gina K Ink, but you really could use any inking tools or inks you have. The white heat embossing on the letters will resist the color. Then that white heat embossing on the letters will blend into the white heat embossing we have on the background for continuous pattern. So I'll continue to add different colors on each of the letters. Notice that after you apply the ink, you really should use a dry cloth to take the excess ink off the white heat embossing so that the white stands out nicely. After I colored each die cut letter, I added a craft foam die cut behind it for that dimension and then popped it in place onto our background on a Gina K Whisper note card that I created from the Whisper cardstock. Now here you can see that white heat embossing on the background and how it's continuous over the background and letters, but our letters are colorful and have the dimension behind them. Embossed resist is one of my favorite all-time techniques, and I love that I was able to combine it together with the Eclipse technique for a colorful but soft card. Okay, my last pair of examples is another that's 2 for 1, where we can create 2 cards at once, but this time we're doing colorful dimension behind our letters. Now in this case, I'm using the Pinkfresh Studio Adore dies to create the word hugs. And you can see I have my purple tape up there. It now comes in a 1/2 inch wide, which is perfect to put in a tape dispenser so that I can easily get the pieces I need. And then when I'm done with them, I can put the pieces back on the side, as you can see I have here, so that I can reuse them over and over. Now that I have all my letters connected, I'm going to die cut it from the bottom center of a piece of white cardstock that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I will do the same on colorful cardstock too, cut to the same size. Now I did a rainbow, so I did 5 different colors in a rainbow. And you can either do 1 layer of each color or do 2 layers. And I'll show you what the 2 layers look like, because that's what I decided to do today, because it makes the rainbow stand out even more. So let me show you. I die cut from the white cardstock first. Now I'm cutting it from the pink cardstock, and then I will continue to do it with the other colors. In each case, I'm trying to die cut from the same area on our colored panels. After I did all of that die cutting, I have all of these colorful letters, and I can glue them together in rainbow order. So I'm gluing 2 pink die cuts first, then I'm doing 2 orange die cuts right behind it, 2 yellow, 2 green, 2 blue. For less dimension, you could just do 1 of each color, but by doing 2, you can see more of the rainbow from the side when the card is complete. I like to use a liquid adhesive like Gina K Connect to put these layers together, and it goes by pretty quickly. Once I have my stacked rainbow of hugs die cuts put together, it's time to assemble the card. I'm putting lots of adhesive onto a piece of cardstock, then taking the white negative space and positioning it over that adhesive. That way the open letters have adhesive showing through. And you can see I also stamped a sentiment with black ink underneath it from the Pinkfresh Studio sentiment stamp set that I showed you earlier. Now on the top of each of my stacked rainbow letters, I added the white on top, and now we're gluing it in place. So from the front, you just see white, but from the side, you see the stacked rainbow, which is just so unique and so much fun. So I trimmed that panel down a little bit, and I added it onto a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch black note card. And you can see I also glued a rainbow strip of cardstocks behind the die cut panel. And that way I could have a splash of color on the side of the card that matched the colors that are behind each of the letters. Remember that this particular technique is excellent for using up colored scraps. You can use those for the letters that you die cut and add for the dimension. I decided to use the negative space from all of those hugs die cuts to create a reverse eclipse. In this case, the letters are set back, and you can see the color inside of each of those little windows. Now for this one, I also used the coordinating Pinkfresh Studio Adore alphabet stamp set. This is designed to go with the alphabet dies that we've been using, or you can use it separately. There are also some fun little doodads in the stamp set that you can use to decorate the letters, but I decided not to use those today. Off screen, I glued together our negative space backgrounds for the letter hugs so that I have the white on top, and then I had a pink, orange, yellow, green, and blue layer behind it. I only did one of each color, so this doesn't have as much dimension. Now I am going to black heat emboss the letter hugs inside of each window. So I'll stamp with VersaFine Onyx black ink. Then I'll add clear embossing powder on that, and that'll give it a lovely shine after we heat emboss it. So I did the H in the H window, I'll do the U in the U window, and we'll complete our card that way. It's fun that when you look into those die cut openings, you see the color behind, and I think that would be really fun in a shaker card too. Okay, so here you can see the completed card. I just added it onto white note card. The only time you see color is when you tilt it, but when you pick up the card and hold it in real life, it's much more obvious than on the video. So this type of reverse eclipse card is a fun way to use up any negative spaces you have left over from your regular eclipse cards. Okay, there you have lots of ways of doing this technique. I hope you'll try one of them. If you are interested in these supplies, they're always in my YouTube description. Over on my blog is much more information for you, so be sure to head there. And in the middle are some similar videos that I think might be helpful to you. I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you again very soon.